I spent 16 years in the Marine Corps, and when I got out around the 2017 holiday period, I felt kind of lost. I drove Uber for a while, helped an old platoon mate get his landscaping business up and running, and then dipped my toe into celebrity bodyguarding. But if working those jobs taught me anything, it's that I'm just not a people person. Working with Marines is different. There was structure to it, discipline, and no offense to the general civilian population, but y'all are animals. Not that Marines aren't, but driving people around, dealing with paparazzi, and having suburban housewives demand more respect than most Marine Corps officers would. That was a whole other level of ass pain. It got to the point where I was seriously considering to move into private security, which was something I promised myself I'd never get into. But then, funnily enough, the ex-Marine I spoke to, who had a link to the industry, ended up suggesting something completely different. And once I heard it, I couldn't keep my mind off of it. He said he knew a guy that had been in a similar situation, needed to transition back to civilian life, but more conventional jobs just weren't clicking for him. The guy worked a ton of different jobs, hated every one of them. Then, almost at random, he decides to try being a wilderness guide for a little while. That was 4 years ago. His buddy had been a guide ever since up near Marble Mountain, said it was the best decision he ever made. I asked the ex-Marine guy a whole bunch of questions about it, and he told me what he knew. He said his buddy basically worked for himself, so he set his own hours and had the freedom to pick his own clients. Then all he did for a living was hike with folks, camp with them, and impart all the survival skills he'd learned in the military in the process. People paid him handsomely, too. It wasn't just some minimum wage thing. I guess his veteran status helped him out in that respect, but he was making great money all the same. We talked about the whole private security thing too, but after we went our separate ways, it was the wilderness guide thing that really stuck in my mind. About 3 months later, I was driving up to Fresno for a job interview at a small veteran-owned wilderness tours company. The interview went great. I impressed the boss enough to get me hired, and I've been at that place ever since. I guess the reason I'm telling you all of this is because I thought working up in Fresno would be the beginning of my quiet and peaceful life as a civilian. I'd done 2 tours of Iraq, 1 tour of Afghanistan, saw my fair share of casualties, and lost count of the number of times I'd been shot at. I'd always be a Marine, but I was happy not to have that life anymore. I didn't want the violence, or the craziness, or the danger. But in taking one particular job at this wilderness guiding company, I somehow ended up having a brush with something far stranger and far more frightening than anything I ever came across in the Marine Corps. It all started when my boss got a call from a solo hiker that we'll just call Chuck. Chuck wasn't the guy's name, but for a whole bunch of reasons, internet crazies being just one, I'm going to change the names of some people and places to protect the affected. Chuck wanted to hire a wilderness guide to take him to a certain hilltop out in one of the forests east of Fresno. He wanted to hike out there, camp overnight, and then head back the way he came. The easiest route to the place was about 18 miles off-road, and since Chuck wasn't an experienced hiker, I figured we could do around 9 miles the first day, then make camp, then walk the other 9 miles the next day before getting to the place Chuck actually wanted to camp. He was in his mid-30s, wiry, and not the most athletic of people. So when we met for the first time to walk him through the journey that we'd laid out for him, I knew that I'd made the right decision to take it easy on him. We'd be gone for 3 nights. We'd provide everything he needed in terms of food, water, and equipment. All he needed to do was show up in suitable clothing, and we'd take care of everything else. That first meeting was a Tuesday afternoon, and it was an important one too, because if either of us decided that we wouldn't be comfortable guiding someone into the wilderness, then the hike was a no-go. We never took anyone we figured would be in danger to themselves while out in the wilderness, not just because we were afraid of lawsuits, because it's straight up irresponsible. But then, when Chuck stopped by the little strip mall office that we were operating out of, he seemed fine. He paid attention during the brief, respected the fact that I had the final say when it came to keeping him safe, and was polite and well-spoken while he agreed to our other terms too. There wasn't a single warning sign that gave us any indication of what might happen or what he might do. And so that Friday morning, I met Chuck at the office, and we drove down towards our line of departure together in my truck. We set off just after 6:30 in the morning, so neither of us were in the mood for talking on the drive out to the park, but after we got going on the hike, we got into a little small talk. Chuck asked about my time in the Marine Corps, and I told him a story or two. PG-13, of course, so not to freak him out or anything. After that, I asked what Chuck did, and he told me that he was some kind of professor. Not the teaching kind, though. He was like the researching kind at a university. He told me he specialized in physics, but I'll be damned if I could tell you exactly what he said. It was something like something theory, and I actually laughed out loud when he asked if I've heard of it or not. He didn't figure I had, but he asked all the same, then he gave me a little breakdown of the kinds of things he researched. Again, I can't say that I could ever recall any of it. It all sounded like mumbo-jumbo to me, but you can tell that he was a seriously intelligent dude and that the work that he did was pretty important. Not long after, we got on to why he wanted to go out onto this particular hilltop, and for the sake of ease, I'll just call it Beartooth Mountain. Generally speaking, we didn't ask exactly why people wanted to visit this or that mountain because the answer was usually a variation on, we heard it's got nice views. Beartooth was no different. It had awesome views and it was definitely much easier to get to than most other peaks, but I guess I just found myself curious if it had some kind of deeper significance to him. I feel like Chuck was open and honest with me, right up until we hit that point of the conversation because, for the first time, I felt like his answer was a little dodgy. He said an uncle used to take him camping out that way when he was a kid, which on the surface sounded like a good enough reason. But if that was me, and I wanted to take my little nephew somewhere camping to introduce him to the great outdoors, Beartooth Mountain is so isolated and such a tough hike that it's just about one of the last places I'd think to take him. Between Stanislaus, Yosemite, Sierra, and Sequoia, the parks and forests around Fresno got to be home to at least 1,000 different campgrounds, most of which are very family-friendly. So for the guy's uncle to march him all the way out to Beartooth, I figured that he was either ex-military or verging on abusive. But no, they got along great and he wasn't any sort of veteran. Chuck just said that he and his family enjoyed the outdoors. Enjoying the outdoors is one thing, but making your kids march out into the deep woods over difficult terrain, that's like survivalist level kind of stuff. And like I said, Chuck didn't strike me as any survivalist. But you see, while I might have been thinking all of that, I'm not dumb or rude enough to just come out and say it. If a client doesn't want me to know why they want to go someplace and they decide to make something up on the fly to protect their privacy while remaining polite, then what kind of a jerk would that make me to go and pry any further? So the way it went was more like him saying the thing about his uncle, me just being like, cool, alright, and then the topic of conversation just kind of naturally flowed onto other things. Chuck was pretty good company actually, at least for that first day and night anyway. Like I said earlier, he definitely wasn't used to the physical strain of hiking long distances, but he showed a heck of a lot of character at times. I was in no doubt that we'd hit our 9-mile goal by day's end, and when we did, he was about ready to sleep standing up and was snoring by 9:30. And that was fine by me. I'd rather get an early night than stay up talking or drinking like some clients want to and end up paying for it in the morning. So, after dousing the fire and setting up a few bear alarms, I decided to get myself an early night too, thinking that the next day was going to be some more relaxed hiking. But I could not have been more wrong. The next morning, Chuck was awake and ready to roll before I was, which was great, and as the day went on, he seemed to get more and more keyed up the closer we got to our destination. He was like a kid in the backseat of a car on the way to Disney World, basically asking me, "Are we there yet?" every half hour or so, until finally, we hit the crest of a hill, broke through some trees, and there she was, Beartooth Mountain. Like I said, I've switched up some of the names here to save you any trouble, but Beartooth really did look like a big old bear's tooth. Just this badass-looking mountain with a sharply curved rocky peak. It's pretty common for clients to get excited about arriving at their destination, and if Chuck's story was true, then I understand why he was psyched to be reunited with a place that had all kinds of nostalgia about it for him. But to me, that's not how he acted. It was more like a religious thing, like how I imagine a person would act if they saw something sacred. I kind of feel like if that was me, I'd have done a little vocal reminiscing or something. You know, like, I remember this one time Uncle Bob said X, or this reminds me when Uncle Bob did Y. But that whole time, Chucky never once brought up any kind of memory or story from his childhood. I was so curious at that period that I even asked him if any memorable trips came to mind, or if he had any particular treasured memories or anything like that. Not in a confrontational way, just, making conversation. He gave me some wishy-washy answers like all of the, I guess, it just feels good to be back. But by then, I could tell something was kind of off. Not so off I wanted to turn around or anything. Like I said earlier, a client is entitled to their privacy, I just hoped that things wouldn't get any weirder. But boy, they did. I figured Chuck might have a particular place that he wanted to camp, so on the approach, I asked him if he had any place in mind. It turns out he did have a place in mind, a very specific place, and to find it, he pulled out a laminated computer printout that had a bunch of notes written on it in Sharpie. I could read maps well enough to know that I was looking at Bear Mountain and the surrounding area, but then I have no idea what all the notes and stuff said. Some of it looked kind of like math, other parts looked like some kind of shorthand, and before I could ask what any of it meant, Chuck pointed to a spot on the map that had a colored dot on it. There was a bunch of these colored dots all over the map, maybe 10 or 12 of them, all spread out about a mile or two apart. But Chuck pointed to just one and said that he wanted to camp somewhere around there. I told him I could take him to any spot he wanted, give or take about 50 yards, but I also wanted to know what all the colored dots meant. Chuck replied that they were all places he and his uncle used to camp back when he was a kid. And that was the point that I actually started buying into Chuck's story a little. I got an ex whose kid was real quiet and shy, but very organized and hyper-focused on whatever he was doing. I can't remember if there was a specific name for what he had, but I know that he was probably on the autism spectrum. My point is, I figured Chuck might have been the same way, and that's why he seemed a little off. But once again, I was there in a professional capacity, so to get paid, I just had to get him to Beartooth and get him out again. If it wasn't impacting our safety, then it didn't really matter to me. So I get Chuck to the campsite he wanted, then after studying his map a little to make sure that we were in exactly the right place, we set up our tents again, made a campfire, and then made dinner. Once he knew we were in the right place, whatever the hell that meant, Chuck seemed to calm down a little bit. But unlike the first night, when he crashed almost right after dinner, he was still up around sunset when I myself was starting to get drowsy. We just talked till then, and not about anything in particular either, just this and that, and like I said, he seemed chilled out again. Nothing he did or said gave me any cause for concern. I felt like a new stepdad or something, telling him not to stay up too late, but he said he wanted to enjoy the night sky a little and wouldn't be too tired come sunup. I said all right, climbed into my tent, and then went to sleep. A couple of hours later, I woke up to hear the sound of a tent unzipping. I remember sitting up just to make sure that it wasn't my own tent being unzipped, and then realized that the noise must have been coming from Chuck's. Now, I cannot overemphasize how common it is for dudes to wake up in the middle of the night and need to take a leak. So 99 times out of 100, hearing someone's tent opening up after dark is no reason to be concerned. But even so, I called out to Chuck to see if all was good, and he replied that he was fine before saying, "Thanks, man." I know this might sound kind of cheesy or whatever, but the way he said it, it sounded real heartfelt, Like he really appreciated me looking out for him like that. I was half asleep at the time, so I just told him, "No problem, buddy," and then went back to sleep, thinking it was nothing more than what it was. Nowadays, I think he was thanking me for a whole lot more. And the next morning, I woke up, put my boots on, and then the first thing I always do each morning when I'm on a trip like that is check on the client. I never just stick my head into their tent or anything, and I don't unzip their tent if it's zipped up neither. I'll just stand outside, gently trying to wake them up. I called Chuck's name once, twice, then 3 times, and Nothing even moves inside the tent. At that point, I'm starting to worry that Chuck has had some kind of medical emergency, so I kneel down, unzip his tent, and open up the flap to find that it's empty. I'm still trying to rationalize things, so I assume Chuck has gone for a walk or something. I don't see any boots, so I'm assuming that he's wearing them and that he's off taking an early morning whiz or something. So off I go, searching for Chuck, having to kind of mentally talk myself out of a panic. I circled the camp, calling out his name, but Chuck's nowhere to be found. So I walk a larger circle, calling out a little louder, and that panicked feeling is coming back as more and more time goes by. I keep walking that loop, mentally preparing myself for some kind of emergency when something catches my eye. And at first, I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing, or actually it was more like I didn't want to believe it. Between these two trees about 50 yards down the slope was a pile of clothes, and it looked like they were sitting on a pair of boots too. As you can imagine, my first thought that goes through my mind is Chuck's gone nuts, stripped naked, and then walked off into the woods, which was not something I wanted to have to deal with. Someone going missing, that's bad, really bad. Someone going missing after taking off all of their clothes, I think we can agree that that's a whole other level of crap hitting the fan. So, right after I see the clothes and I'm 100% sure they're Chuck's, I start off on emergency procedures. So that's call the Rangers, call my boss, call everyone I possibly can, then get a head start on searching for our client. Situations like that are always time critical, but then my situation was even more so, for obvious reasons, so I went running back to where Chuck's clothes were and started looking for any signs of a trail. Now here's where I'll admit that I've never been much of a tracker, so all I really did was walk off in the direction I figured he might have gone, but I didn't find anything but empty woods. I had to wait until the Rangers showed up before we could cover any real ground, then by the time the cops and the search and rescue folks arrived, there was no reason for me to be there anymore once I'd given an officer a statement. I felt awful. Having a client go missing like that is the nightmare scenario for any wilderness guide. It's our one job, to keep people safe, and when we fail at that one thing, it's like a punch in the gut. I talked to my boss at length about the whole thing, and he gave me a week off to get my head straight. He was closing the office out of respect for Chuck's family, and since he was a big part of the volunteer search parties, there was only one other person to take on the workload. So, better we just close and help out. I wanted to be there myself, but my boss, being the wise man that he is, told me it'd be better if I stayed away and put my faith in the Rangers, the state SNR, and everyone else they had out there looking for Chuck. I was just one guy. And what was one guy versus all kinds of helicopters, sniffer dogs, and specially trained trackers who'd put even force recon guys to shame? I was told over and over again that it wasn't my fault, that I'd done everything right and that I had nothing to feel guilty over. But then came the day when, even with the cops being so cool and respectful, I could tell people were starting to doubt my innocence. The day the cops came to ask me a few questions, I figured it was just all follow-up stuff or questions they hadn't thought to ask me yet or whatever. But then, there came a point during the questioning where I realized that I wasn't being looked upon as an innocent party anymore. I guess the detectives were just eliminating potential suspects, but it was pretty damn chilling knowing that they were considering the possibility that it was me that was to blame for Chuck going missing. I actually said to them at one point, "Look, I'm an open book. I got nothing to hide, and I'll come help with the search effort if you want me to." They acted innocent, like they were only there to ask a few questions and nothing more. But I could tell that they were putting on the good cop routine in hopes that I'd slip up and change my story. That way, they could justify focusing on me as their number one suspect. I told my boss what was happening or what I thought was happening, and he just told me to sit tight and ride it out. After that, I got pretty much all my info from him directly, and over the weeks that followed, this is what he told me. I was only completely eliminated as a suspect when the cops found no DNA but Chuck's on his abandoned clothes, which suggested that he just got up in the early hours of the morning, walked down the hilltop a little, and then walked off into the woods before taking off all of his clothes. The search and rescue tracker dogs followed his scent trail to a shallow stream, then lost it, suggesting that he washed himself in the water for some reason. Some suggested this was deliberate, as in he knew it would confuse the tracker dogs when it came time to look for him. But that made it seem like Chuck was in his right mind when he was walking off through the woods without a stitch of clothing on him. And to the likes of me and my boss, Chuck must have totally lost his mind if he thought that he could do something like that and not be in real danger. I asked my boss if the cops must have known something that we didn't about Chuck's state of mind. He said he had no idea, that he'd been involved in a couple of missing person cases before and that Chuck's made no sense to him whatsoever. In the other two cases, the person was found safe and fine within 24 hours, and both involved were hikers who got a little too confident after wandering off the trails. People figured that the same thing would happen with Chuck, as without any suitable shoes, there's no way that he couldn't gotten so far that the search teams wouldn't pick him up. But that's the thing. No one found a single trace of him anywhere in the surrounding area. It was like he just dropped off the face of the earth. After a few weeks, the search was called off, and although California's Park Service promised that they'd continue to keep an eye out for him, people eventually just accepted that Chuck was gone. I tried to move on. I tried to just file it away with all the other bullcrap I've filed away over the years, but all the unanswered questions almost drove me crazy. I got a lot of closure with the stuff that I went through in the Marine Corps, and at least before I separated, the top brass were pouring a ton of money into counseling, psychologists, and all kinds of things to fix the mental wounds and not just the physical ones. But that whole process of reconciling what's happened to you, that's all way easier when you have some actual answers. X was in a certain place, and then Y happened, and Z was the result. But with the Chuck thing, nothing made sense. There were no answers. His disappearance was never solved, and thinking about it caused me a hell of a lot of grief for a long, long time. And on top of that, Chuck's not the only person to have gone missing in that area of the forest. There have been a bunch of unexplained disappearances in that area, and sometimes I can't help but wonder if they're somehow connected to Chuck's. For the longest time, my best friend since childhood was obsessed with northern British Columbia up in Canada. I guess to some people that might sound like an odd place to become fixated on, but once I saw some of the pictures on her Instagram feed posted by hiking influencers who often visited the region, I started to understand why. Northern BC is one of the most beautiful places in the entire world, and although Lana, my BFF, wasn't like an active hiker or anything, she fell in love with the place. She said it was one of her dreams to visit Atlin Provincial Park, and all because of this mountain that they called the Cathedral. Just below the peak, there's like a strip of flat land with a small lake on it that turns piercing blue in the summer, and Lana was just totally obsessed with it. She had one photo of it as her phone background for months on end, and then when she finally switched it up for another, it was yet another picture of the cathedral. The last straw was when she started saying things like, "It sucks I'll never get to visit. I don't have anyone to go with." I guess I just wanted to be that kind of friend that helped her dreams come true, so I started looking in how to get there. I found out that we could catch a seaplane to a place called Peggy's Island, and from there, a wilderness tours company could take us all the way over to the foothills of the cathedral by boat. After that, it was really just a case of climbing the cathedral's slopes, which apparently weren't all that steep, and then there you go. We were at my best friend's #1 favorite location on Earth, and a place she thought that she'd never, ever see. I figured if I planned the whole thing in secret, told her to expect a weekend vacation to Cancun around the date of her 29th birthday, and then actually pulled the whole thing off, I'd be the greatest friend in the history of friends. It took a load of saving and planning, but eventually, I was able to spring the surprise on her. And for months, I've been telling her that we were headed down to Mexico for a few days in the sun, which is how I made sure that she had a valid passport without alerting her to my real plan. Then, on the very same morning that we were due to fly down to Cancun, I got to see her face when I told her that we weren't headed to Mexico. We were headed to Port Hardy on Vancouver Island, where we'd catch a seaplane all the way up to Peggy's Island and the cathedral. And she was ecstatic. And although it meant that she had to totally repack, I'd made her dream come true. But if I'd have known what I was getting us into, like actually getting us into, I wouldn't have been so happy at all. We caught our flights up to Vancouver, made our way to Port Hardy, and then flew all the way up to northern BC in our very own tin bucket of a chartered seaplane. That flight alone could have made for its own scary story, but we made it up to Peggy Island safely and set up our tents at one of the campsites they had there. After that, we had our first face-to-face with the person that'd be our tour guide the following day. Charles was around the same age as Lana and I, late 20s or early 30s, and to be totally honest, he was a very beautiful man. You could tell that he worked out a bunch and wore a tight Ranger-style uniform to show it off, but he also pulled it off too. He had deep brown eyes and a mustache that somehow didn't make him look like a creep, but only more masculine. He was handsome, charming, funny, and we thought that we'd hit a total jackpot with him being assigned as our tour guide. And after walking us through the plan for the next morning, we went back to our campsite and relaxed until it was time to sleep. The next morning, we met up with Charles bright and early, had a little hot breakfast over at the tour center, and then climbed into the boat that took us across the lake to where the cathedral was. Charles was just as charming as he'd been the day before, even in spite of it being so early in the morning, and he even took us on a small tour of the lake, stopping so we could take pictures before heading over to the shore on the other side. It took us a while to get up to the flat part of the mountain. We've been going hiking together in the run-up to the trip, putting Lana through some unexpected mountain climbing training. But even with all we'd done, hiking up the cathedral was tough. We were spent by the time we reached the flat section that we'd seen so many times on Instagram. But when we did, it was every bit as magical as in the pictures, which meant each of us got very emotional. Charles just watched on with a smile, letting us have our little moment together, and then, at some point, I looked over to see him talking into his radio. Charles had been checking in with the tour center every so often the whole time that we'd been out, so seeing him talking into his radio wasn't unusual or concerning in the slightest. Lana and I carried on doing our thing, taking pictures and videos, etc., until suddenly, Charles called out that we had to end the trip prematurely. I remember turning around to see him looking kind of anxious before asking why exactly we needed to cut things short. We'd agreed to climb a little more of the mountain so we could get some more shots of the views on the other side, so as much as we were happy to be up there, we felt a little short-changed that our guide was suddenly calling time on the proceedings. I remember asking why we needed to head back early, and I'm being 100% honest when I say that. If he'd given any kind of half-decent answer, I would have complied without complaint. But when I asked why, all Charles said in a very uncharacteristically rude way was, "Don't question my decisions." I guess that, on paper, that sounds fine, and that maybe some kind of unforeseen problem had arisen, but I literally cannot overemphasize how much "don't question my decision" sounded like "because I said so." I asked again why we needed to head back early and was almost stunned into silence when the same man who'd been veritable Prince Charming just 24 hours previously suddenly became incredibly rude and abrupt. And not just rude, this might be hard to describe, but Charles almost seemed scared, and scared in a way that he was trying to mask it with bravado. And this led me to keep asking him why we had to leave early, because naturally, if we were facing any kind of real danger, like a storm or something similar, then we wanted to know about it. We'd also paid for a whole day's worth of our tour guide's time, so we wanted to know if we'd be getting a partial refund or something to that effect. I guess this makes us sound like total Karens in a way, but I swear to God, if Charles had just said something like, "Okay, ladies, we got a sudden storm front heading in, so we just need to conclude this tour a little earlier than expected," we both would have been like, "Okay, no problem, let's go." But we felt like we were being kept in the dark by a guy whose sudden turn in behavior was deeply alarming, and that just didn't sit right with me at all. Eventually, Charles said, "F this," turned turned around and then started walking off towards the trail which led back down the mountain. But he didn't just wander off either. It looked like he was walking off as fast as he possibly could, and considering he was a tall, fit guy and an experienced hiker, it wasn't long before he'd put a very worrying amount of distance between Lana and I, who by that point had no choice but to follow quickly. We kept yelling for him, calling out Charles's name and begging him to wait up so we could catch up to him, but he didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He just kept on walking down the mountainside, putting more and more distance between us as time went by. It got to the point where Lana and I thought that he was going to leave us behind, and all we had with us was our bags with a little bit of water, some snacks, and some waterproof material. We had no maps, no compass, nothing to tell us where we were exactly or which direction we were going. So if Charles actually left us there alone, we would be in a lot of trouble. It was Lana who first suggested that he might just leave us there and drive off in the boat, and when she did, we both went into full panic mode. We started screaming, like full-on screaming for Charles, begging him to wait for us and not leave us behind. And then finally, he stopped. But he didn't just stop dead on the trail, and he didn't start walking back up towards us either. He just started like pacing back and forth and talking to himself. And I say talking to himself, but it was more like he'd walk in a circle, fists clenched, and every so often he'd yell something that either we could or couldn't understand. As we got closer, he started yelling things at us in the same sort of way, like he was literally so furious that you could only make out every other thing he was saying. I managed to catch things like, "Always gotta have things your way," and "never think about anyone but yourselves," but the rest was pretty much garbled yells. I guess instinct kicked in for me because I started apologizing to Charles over and over, because by then, I'd have done almost anything to get him to calm down so we could just leave in peace. Lana started apologizing too, but it didn't seem to do any good. He just kept pacing around and yelling about how we needed to listen, how no one ever listened to him, and how was he supposed to act when no one listened to him. It was only then that it occurred to me that something else was going on. There wasn't an emergency, or at least there didn't seem to be one if Charles was content to just stop on the trail like that. But then, something had definitely happened to make him start acting that way, and the change seemed to occur after he talked into his radio for a minute. I still had no idea how the two things were connected, as in like, what was said that made him go crazy, but it definitely seemed like he was having some kind of breakdown right there on the mountainside. We kept apologizing, begging him to just calm down and take us back to the tour center, and although he eventually agreed, Charles's mood did not improve. He yelled at us to follow him and not fall behind, and then he marched off again at the same speed that he had previously. Luckily, we were much closer to where the boat was parked, so we didn't fall too far behind, and we were able to make it to the shore just as he was starting up the boat. He was still yelling when he told us to climb in, and he also seemed to be gradually calming down, like he was on the back end of whatever he was going through. Only with that in mind did we climb back into the boat, but Charles hadn't finished just yet. As he drove us across the lake, Charles carried on that thing of like being quiet for a while and then yelling a curse word or something, but he also drove way faster than he had before, to the point that it was actually scary. Lana and I kept yelling slow down, and at first, he'd just yell stuff back that was drowned out by the sound of the engine and the water. We went a little further, and we started yelling again for him to stop, and then suddenly, he did. He stopped the boat right there in the middle of the lake, turned around, and just sort of seethed at us. He was so flushed his whole face was pink. His fists were clenched, and I swear I've never seen anyone's eyes go so wide in my whole life. I thought he was going to hurt us, kill us even, and out there in the middle of the lake we had nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. It was like he was thinking about it, really weighing up his options, and the voice that was saying don't hurt them was only just barely winning. For as long as I live, I'll never ever forget the sound of Lana saying, "Please don't," in this really shaky voice. I think that actually made him snap out of it a little, because after that, he turned around, got back in the little driver's seat, and then carried on driving the boat back to the dock or whatever, and only by this time in complete silence. All Lana and I did was sit there in the back of the boat, eyes glued to the back of Charles's head, shaking with fear while we each hoped that he wouldn't turn around or stop the boat again. As soon as we arrived back at the dock, Lana literally jumped off the boat onto the wooden dock before Charles had a chance to even bring the boat to a complete stop. I was quick to follow her, but as Lana ran all the way back to our tents, I turned back to give Charles a piece of my mind, basically about how we were going to get him fired for the way he treated us. Again, total Karen thing to say, but it was literally the first thing that came to mind, and all I was thinking about in the moment was warning his boss or coworkers that he was having some kind of violent episode. I guess I was feeling brave because we were back on dry land, but as Charles climbed up onto the dock, I kept on berating him, which, admittedly, was not the best idea ever, because after finding his feet, he walked towards me, wrapped a hand around my throat, and started to squeeze. It was probably the single scariest moment of my entire life, seeing those wild eyes come back again, knowing that he could crush my neck if he wanted to. And worst of all, I felt like an idiot. I should have run back to the tent with Lana, or straight to the tour center to warn Charles' coworkers, and I paid for it by getting choked so hard that I thought I was going to die. Luckily, though, people had already heard me yelling at Charles and were approaching the dock by the time he grabbed my throat. As soon as they saw him do that, they started yelling, and within just a few seconds we were being separated by a bunch of guides and campers. Two of Charles's male coworkers walked him off someplace and we didn't see where, and as the people around us started asking what had happened, we broke down into tears as we told them. Charles had been fine one second, then the next, it was like he was a totally different person. It was honestly so scary to see that kind of change in him, and we had literally no idea what had happened to make him act like that. The head of the tour company then brought us to their office, got us some coffee, and offered to contact the seaplane people so we could leave that day if possible. They were honestly super awesome about the whole thing, probably because they were terrified of getting sued, but all we wanted was a promise that Charles would be fired and to know exactly what he'd been told that made him go crazy like that. The head of the company didn't know everything that had been going on in Charles's life, but she had been the one to pass along that piece of news on the radio. Apparently, she'd gotten a call from his wife asking if Charles was available to talk. Obviously, he wasn't because he was out conducting a tour with us. The head of the company then asked Charles's wife if she'd like to call back, and she said no, and that she never wanted to hear from him again. All she wanted was for the company head to pass along a message. I caught him cheating again. I'm taking the kids, and he's never going to see any of us ever again. Personally, I'd have waited until after the tour to tell him such a life-changing piece of news, but I guess the head of the company thought it was the kind of news Charles needed to hear right away. That part did make me consider hiring an attorney, but like I said, they'd promised to fire Charles and were good enough to tell us something they had every right to withhold, so I decided not to. Filing a lawsuit would have destroyed their company, all over one dumb mistake, and above all, it was Charles's decision alone to act like such a monster, no one else's. And besides, no amount of money could help with the guilt I felt afterwards. Lana said that she didn't need an apology, that it wasn't my fault, and I understand that. But I still feel terrible for promising my best friend the trip of her dreams and pretty much having it turn into a living nightmare. On January 21st of 1842, James and Esther Packer welcomed the first of their 3 children into the world. He was born in Pennsylvania's Allegheny County, not far from the city of Pittsburgh, and the name they gave him was Alfred. When Alfred was around 10 years old, his father moved the family to LaGrange County, Indiana, where he found work as a cabinet maker. Alfred was slow to adjust to the sudden relocation, struggled to find friends among the local children, and developed a profound melancholy as a result. Familial relationships became strained, and during his 16th or 17th year, Alfred left home in the middle of the night, leaving a note which read, "Never coming back." He rode to Minnesota and worked as a shoemaker for a few years, but in April of 1861, the eruption of a fiery civil war would forever alter Alfred's fate. He enlisted in the Union Army during April of the following year and was assigned to Company F of the 16th Infantry Regiment, but was eventually discharged after just 2 years of service following a diagnosis of epilepsy. Alfred then traveled west in the hopes of finding his fortune, and held a variety of jobs such as hunter, ranch hand, and wagon teamster. Yet wherever he went, Alfred proved deeply unpopular with his coworkers, allegedly owing to his argumentative personality, his near-pathological lying, and his reputation for theft. But by the time Alfred arrived in Utah Territory, he'd discovered a profitable profession which suited his contempt for both authority and discipline, that of a wilderness guide. For thousands of years, certain individuals have specialized in guiding unwary travelers across vast and perilous stretches of terrain, and such people were mentioned frequently during the earlier chapters of American history. For instance, Lewis and Clark's 1804 expedition through the American West relied heavily on the knowledge of a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, and the likes of Jim Bridger and Kit Carson made their names trading on their knowledge of the western frontier. A generation later, migrants seeking to flee the aftermath of the Civil War found that skilled wilderness guides were essential to surviving the journey west, and as a result, a capable guide would expect to make vast amounts of money. Alfred rather fancied the idea of becoming a self-employed wilderness guide, but in truth, he was a dangerously inept navigator. He drew the ire of many a dissatisfied customer and was responsible for at least 2 fully loaded wagon trains becoming lost on their way to Oregon. He was ignorant, obnoxious, and incompetent. Yet the demand for wilderness guides was so high that, despite his reputation, he continued to find paying work. One such group of potential employers was headed by a man named Robert McGrew, who intended to prospect for gold near a place called Breckenridge, Colorado, in the winter of 1873. The party consisted of 20 men, whose journey would take them from Utah's Salt Lake City to the San Juan Mountains, around 300 miles to the southeast. It would prove a hazardous journey, and the men were in dire need of a capable guide, so once they reached Provo, a man named George Tracy was sent out to find one. He returned with a 23-year-old gold prospector who just so happened to know the route to Colorado like the back of his hand. Yet this prospector was none other than Alfred Packer. Packer was not 23 years old. He was actually 31 in November of 1873, and as previously stated, he was relentless in his fabrication. Although Packer had a small degree of mining experience, he was no prospector, nor had he ever been to the San Juan Mountains. But in sensing the desperation of McGrew's party, he saw an opportunity to profit. Packer told them that for the price of $25, around $700 in today's money, he could lead them to the gold country south of the Colorado Territory. The group accepted, and then off they went. Almost immediately, Packer's incompetence became painfully obvious to McGrew and his companions. Those who made it to Colorado later said that Packer was not once but twice caught stealing rations from other travelers, but since it appeared that his services were indispensable, he was shown mercy each time. The group's slow progress also meant that by the time they reached the more hazardous sections of their route, they were beset by harsh winter weather. Heavy snow hid the path ahead, forcing the party to rely almost entirely on their compass for direction, and due to Packer's inexperience, it wasn't long before they became lost completely. When their rations ran out, the men ate horse feed. When the horse feed ran out, they ate their horses. But in the 3rd week of January 1874, the party came across an isolated island of salvation in the form of a Native American encampment. Chief Ouray, also known as the White Man's Friend, made his winter encampment in the Uncompahgre Valley near modern-day Montrose. He was famous for his generosity to needy travelers and supplied McGrew's party with food and lodgings by which they could regain their strength for the journey to come. However, Chief Ouray strongly recommended that the party postpone their expedition until spring, since they were likely to encounter dangerous winter weather as they reached the San Juan Mountains. The natives knew that to undertake such a journey would be to risk certain death, and Chief Uray offered to shelter their party until early spring, whereupon they could continue their venture in relative safety. The party of 20 convened to discuss their options, but 11 of them refused to accept the chief's offer. In their view, delaying their expedition until early spring would roll out the red carpet to other less risk-adverse prospectors, delay their journey, and they miss out on the lion's share of the gold. A few days following his arrival at Chief Uray's camp, Robert McGrew approached him with their final decision. 11 of them would continue on towards the Los Pinos Indian Agency, which was the closest outpost to the camp, and proceed onward to Breckenridge from there. Chief Uray stated that he respected the party's courage and provided them with food for their journey, as well as safe directions to bypass the mountains. However, just hours into their journey, Alfred Packer announced that he had a better idea. Instead of bypassing the mountains by way of Indian Territory, Packer proposed the group take a much more direct route through the mountains. Obviously, most of the party understood Packer was an incompetent navigator, but at this juncture, it seems their desire for enrichment outweighed any kind of common sense. 5 of the party continued along the safer route, but 6 others, Packer included, decided to risk the snowy passes of the San Juan Mountains. Aside from Packer himself, the group consisted of Shannon Wilson Bell, James Humphrey, Frank Butcher Miller, George California Noon, and Israel Swan. McGrew and a handful of his loyalists proceeded to aid Packer's group in their initial departure, but once the snows grew too deep for heavily laden pack horses, they unloaded Packer's supplies and then headed back to Chief Uray's encampment. Packer and his party then continued along the Gunnison River and then began climbing the higher paths which led into the mountains. But this, as many have reasoned, was pure insanity. The men had less than 2 weeks' rations, no snowshoes, no flint to light a fire, and wore clothing that was thoroughly unsuited to the intense Colorado winter. Finally, on April 16th of 1874, a full 65 days following the departure of Packer's party, a lone figure stumbled out of the woods near modern-day Saguache, Colorado. As they sat eating breakfast, a group of Ute tribesmen spotted the man limping towards them. He carried with him a rifle, a knife, a steel coffee pot, and a satchel. When they rode out to meet him, they found a man on the verge of total starvation. It was Alfred Packer, who had somehow survived the journey into the mountains. The men sat him down at the table and gave him some food, but upon attempting to chew and swallow it, Packer promptly vomited. The tribesmen feared that Packer was ill with some kind of infectious disease, but he assured them that his condition was the result of prolonged starvation and he was of no danger. The tribesmen then asked Packer what had happened to lead him to starvation, and this is what he told them. Packer explained that he had been hired by 5 prospectors to guide them to Breckenridge. However, during the course of their journey, he began to suffer a terrible bout of snow blindness and began to lag behind. Packer then claimed that when it was clear that he could not continue, his employers abandoned him, leaving him with nothing but a rifle, a few rounds of ammunition, and 2 cans of preserves. From then on, he had been forced to find his way back to civilization alone, and after exhausting his meager rations, had eaten roots, rosebuds, and even the leather of his own shoes to escape death by starvation. It made for one hell of a story, and most who heard it displayed a great deal of sympathy for the haggard-looking wanderer. Yet to other more senior members of the tribe, Packer's story did not match his condition. Packer had not been the first unwise traveler to have erred under the might of the Colorado winter, but others who'd emerged from the forests of the San Juan foothills had been so malnourished they appeared skeletal. Alfred Packer, on the other hand, looked relatively healthy, and the bloating around his cheeks and chin suggested that he'd been binging on cheap whiskey. Under the assumption that Packer was dead broke, the Indian Agency's Justice of the Peace purchased his Winchester rifle for the generous price of $10. The filthy pre-owned rifle could have been purchased for considerably less, but the money was partly intended to help poor Packer get back on his feet. Having seen enough horrors to last a lifetime, Packer claimed his days as a wilderness guide were over, and that he intended to return home to Pennsylvania. But upon his arrival in the nearby town of Sawatch, Packer began a veritable spending spree. He purchased a horse for $70, spent $78 on whiskey and tobacco in Otto Mears' general store, then dropped $100 to book the finest hotel room at Dolan's Saloon for the foreseeable future. The amount of money Packer spent is the equivalent of thousands upon thousands of dollars today, which raised the question, just where exactly did an apparently destitute man get so much money? Packer remained in Sawatch spending like a sailor in Dolan's Saloon until one day, 3 men walked through its swing doors. Packer recognized them in an instant. It was Preston Nutter, one of the 9 men who'd chosen to winter at Chief Uray's camp, rather than face certain death on the trail to the San Juan Mountains. And behind him stood 2 other members of Robert McGrew's original party. Nutter approached Packer at his table and asked where the other members of his group were. Packer recounted his story of abandonment, but Nutter was skeptical. It would have been extremely unwise for men so unfamiliar with the region to have abandoned their only guide, even if they did display signs of incompetence. Sure, the men had been foolhardy to try and brave the Colorado winter, but they were not insane. Nutter also found it odd that Packer was given one of only 2 rifles the group was in possession of, even though he was already armed with a revolver. Yet the final straw came when Nutter noticed a skinning knife hanging from Packer's belt. It was a knife belonging to a man named Frank Butcher Miller, one of the 5 party members that accompanied Packer on their final leg of the journey. When Nutter asked how Packer had come to be in possession of it, he claimed that Miller had simply stuck it in a tree and then walked off without it. Packer then claimed that after asking Miller if he wanted the knife, he was told he could have it. But Nutter didn't believe a word. He'd spent enough time with Frank the Butcher to know that he'd prided himself on his ability to cleanly and efficiently butcher an animal. He'd carried that same skinning knife with him on hundreds of hunts, and to say it was a precious possession would be a major understatement. Nutter knew something was wrong, terribly wrong, and in the face of Packer's obvious deceptions, he became irate. He was said to have lunged at Packer, demanding he speak the truth, and since he was quite visibly the aggressor, he was tossed out of Dolan's and then barred from entry until the week's end. Meanwhile, back in Colorado, the 5-man splinter group who'd rode on towards the mountains rather than winter with Chief Uray arrived at the Los Pinos Indian Agency. They were greeted by the agency's administrator, a General Charles Adams, who told them he'd already met with a man named Packer, who claimed to have been abandoned by his fellow travelers. Oliver Lautzenheiser, who'd headed the 5-man group that did not contain Packer, claimed this was impossible. The prospectors Packer had been riding with were good, decent men who would have never abandoned one of their number, no matter how much of a burden they were. Suspecting some kind of foul play and knowing Packer to be a compulsive liar, Lautzenheiser convinced General Adams to have Packer arrested, but the general himself chose a far shrewder course of action. Adams sent a trio of soldiers out looking for Alfred Packer, but after finding him in Sawatch, they didn't simply put him in cuffs. The lead soldier initially consoled Packer regarding his recent tribulations and complimented him on the survival skills it must have taken to make it down from the mountains alive. Packer was accustomed to such treatment by that point and welcomed it graciously. The soldier then informed Packer that they wished to hire him at a very generous rate to help recover the missing members of his party. Packer seemed reluctant at first, but following a reminder that proving his innocence to the authorities was a far superior option than vigilante townsfolk assuming his guilt, he agreed to join the search party. When he arrived back at the agency, Packer was immediately brought before General Adams, who had allowed Lautzenheiser's party to witness his questioning. Adams demanded an explanation for the conflicting stories, but an indignant Packer repeated his claim that he'd been abandoned while snowblind and professed deep surprise upon learning his fellow travelers were missing. Adams then questioned him regarding his Sawatch spending habits, but Packer defended himself by claiming the money was a loan from a sympathetic citizen. Upon hearing this, General Adams dispatched another group of riders to Sawatch, who learned that not only had Packer not received any loan, but he'd been spotted with several different wallets during his stay in town. Following the riders' return and confirmation that Packer was lying, General Adams and Lautzenheiser's party began discussing what should be done. Yet as they debated, the arrival of 2 Ute tribesmen prompted an uproar in the camp. The 2 tribesmen had been hunting just a few miles from the Indian Agency, and after reaching the crest of a hill, had come across strips of dried human flesh they'd found lying on a rock. And nearby was the exact same trail Alfred Packer had used during his march for survival. When confronted with the strips of flesh, Packer appeared to break down completely and began begging General Adams for mercy. He then promised to make a full and frank confession after reportedly stating it would not be the first time that people had been obliged to eat each other when they were hungry. Packer claimed that after his party ran out of food, they began, and I quote, eyeing each other in a most unsettling manner. A few days after this dreadful leering commenced, Packer claimed he left camp to gather dry firewood and returned to find 4 of his traveling companions standing around the lifeless body of the 5th. Israel Swan, who was said to be the oldest of the 5 men, was killed instantly when he was struck from behind with a hatchet. In the process of dismembering Swan's body, Packer claimed the group found several $1,000s in cash on his person, and after dividing the money between them, they began roasting and eating chunks of the dead man's flesh. The men ate well that night, so well that just 2 days later, they were once again completely out of food and racked by ravenous hunger. They tried hunting and set snares for rabbits and other small game, but after fresh meat eluded them, a conspiracy was struck. Since Frank Butcher Miller still had a great deal of fat on him, Packer claimed Shannon Bell, James Humphrey, and George Noon convinced him that it was the butcher's turn to be carved up. He too was murdered with a single hatchet blow to the skull, ambushed while stooping to pick up firewood. It was then that Alfred Packer acquired the butcher's skinning knife, fastening it to his belt before he feasted on its owner's still warm cadaver. Packer then claimed that as the 4 remaining travelers pushed on towards Los Pinos, they became lost in a blizzard. Once again, they became ravenously hungry, and this time it was James Humphrey's turn to be ambushed, butchered, and consumed. Packer added that George Noon was murdered before Humphrey's corpse had even been stripped of all its meat, and the killing was wanton now. They had a taste for human flesh. Once the blizzard had cleared, Alfred Packer and Shannon Bell continued their journey towards Los Pinos. They agreed never to speak of their ghastly hunger, nor the manner in which it was sated. They would say that their companions died of exposure and that each was afforded a Christian burial. Packer also claimed that being the only 2 survivors of the 5-man party, he and Bell made a pact that neither man would murder or consume the other. According to Packer, it took just days for this pact to unravel. After 3 more days of trudging through the mountains, frostbitten and exhausted, Packer claimed that he and Bell set up camp next to a lake near a large grove of hemlock trees. The 2 men managed to light a fire, but after a few hours of lying under their blankets and trying not to freeze, Shannon Bell went berserk. Packer claimed Bell threw off his blankets, screaming that he couldn't take it anymore. Then, after snatching up his rifle, he lunged at Packer and attempted to bash in his skull. Packer described how he deflected the blow before striking Bell in the head with the hatchet. Then, fearing that he might starve to death before reaching civilization, Packer cannibalized Bell's corpse and continued on his journey with the dead men's accumulated wealth. Following another day's walking, Packer claimed he mounted the crest of a hill. Upon spotting the Los Pinos Indian Agency in the distance, he threw away the remaining strips of human flesh, but admitted that he did so with, quote, a fair degree of hesitation. After listening to Packer's version of events in full, General Adams called for a discussion of the matter between the surviving prospectors and agency officers. The prospectors stated they didn't believe a word of Packer's story and asked the general to aid them in the information of a search party so that the truth might be uncovered. With agency clerk Herman Lauder at the lead, the 5 Utah prospectors followed a handful of agency officers for 50 miles across the hills, ironically with Packer acting as their guide. Then, after 2 weeks of searching the snowdrifts near Lake Fork, Packer announced that he was lost, forcing a frustrated Lauder to order their return to the agency. However, at some point during the journey back, Packer armed himself with a knife and attempted to murder Herman Lauder. Fortunately, Lauder was able to defend himself, and after the other members of the search party restrained him, Packer was arrested. The failed attempt snuffed out any and all doubt that Packer was an innocent man, with General Adams ordering his immediate transportation to Saguache's jailhouse. During this period of detention, Packer changed his story. He now claimed that after days of hiking with virtually nothing to eat, Israel Swan could go no further. They found a pine-shaded gulch next to a lake and set up camp. A short time after this, Packer asserted that Swan passed away from a combination of hunger and exposure. The following is an extract from his signed confession. Old Man Swan died first and was eaten by the other 5 persons about 10 days out of camp. 4 or 5 days afterwards, Humphreys died and was also eaten. Sometimes afterwards, while I was carrying wood, the butcher was killed, as the other 2 told me accidentally, and he was also eaten. Bell shot California with Swan's gun, and I killed Bell. I covered up the remains and took a large piece of his meat along, then traveled 14 days into the agency. Bell wanted to kill me with his rifle, struck a tree, and broke his gun. Yet while he was in jail, observers challenged his credibility and noted that Packer, far from being a victim of cold or starvation, had set some kind of diabolical trap. Finally, in August of 1874, an illustrator from Harper's Weekly was hiking near a place known as Slumgullion Pass, just 2 miles southeast of Lake City, Colorado. Upon spotting a pine-shaded gulch surrounded by hemlock trees, John A. Randolph believed he'd happened across a prime spot to rest. But as he got closer, he made a horrifying discovery. 5 rotting corpses lay strewn around the gulch. Randolph made a quick sketch of the scene, then rushed to alert the sheriff in nearby Lake City, who, naturally, was only too happy to receive news of the discovery. There was just one problem. From its description, the gulch was the site of the final confrontation between Packer and Shannon Bell, but according to his story, Packer and Bell were alone. In which case, how had the bodies of the murdered and cannibalized men all come to rest in the same spot? The Lake City sheriff rode out to what became known as Dead Man's Gulch, with around 24 volunteers in tow. The scene that greeted them was the stuff of nightmares. One deputy noted that, and I quote, "It appeared as if extreme violence had befallen the men. Frank Miller and Israel Swan's bodies were little more than skeletons, with almost every strip of flesh having been carved from their bones. The bodies of James Humphrey and George Noon lay rotting and flayed, with their legs having been butchered entirely. Both had received blows to the head, with the shape of the wounds indicating a hatchet had been used to dispatch them. Shannon Bell lay with his arms to his sides, his hands skinned with skeletal legs splayed out beneath him. Someone had smashed open the top of his skull and removed his brain entirely. No attempt had been made to consume bone marrow, nor had any of the men's organs been consumed. Packer had simply gone from man to man, stripping the soft, sweet, nutrient-rich muscle from their bones before eating it. The remains of the fallen prospectors were buried where they lay, and when word reached the Saguache County Sheriff, he sent 6 deputies to the jail to confront Packer with their newfound evidence. But when they arrived at the makeshift prison cell on the outskirts of Saguache, Packer was nowhere to be found. In order to prevent his summary execution by bloodthirsty vigilantes, the town sheriff decided that Packer would be held in a makeshift cell on a ranch owned by the county. The cell was little more than a dilapidated log cabin. At the time of Packer's arrival, it was almost completely unfit for human habitation. Prior to the discovery of the missing prospectors, Packer had been held there for months, with no evidence, no bodies, and no formal charges levied against him. Yet, while there were many who were only too happy to see Packer under lock and key, just as many saw his detention as unjust, some bemoaned the extensive tax bill Packer's imprisonment racked up, while others argued it was unconstitutional to incarcerate a man merely suspected of a crime. Such talk among the townsfolk appeared to have generated a great deal of sympathy for Alfred Packer, because when the deputies arrived in late August of 1874, they found the cabin unguarded and deserted. Someone had helped Packer escape. As Saguache's sheriff organized both professional and volunteer tracking teams, local citizens discussed theories on what had motivated Packer to murder and consume his traveling companions. Many believed that he simply attached himself to the party under the false pretense of being familiar with the area, and that ultimately the men had died because of his incompetence. However, a much more popular theory involved Packer leading the party of 5 into the mountains with a premeditated plan to kill and rob them. Preston Nutter and Oliver Lautzenheiser were highly vocal in their condemnations of Packer and did their best to persuade the Saguache townsfolk that the deaths were not some kind of tragic accident, nor was Packer a man of fortitude who'd simply done what was necessary to survive. Yet surprisingly, the details of Packer's cannibalism were not the primary issue. By the late 19th century, the American public were familiar with the tragic tale of the doomed Donner Party. Delayed by a multitude of mishaps, the Donners spent the winter of 1846 snowbound in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Some of the migrants resorted to cannibalism to survive, mainly eating the bodies of those who had succumbed to starvation, sickness, or extreme cold. But in one case, 2 Native American guides were deliberately murdered for this purpose. News of such ghastliness spread fast among the American populace, but after a lengthy national discussion, many expressed a great deal of sympathy for the Donners. And while many argued that they themselves would not have committed murder, very few were able to categorically state that they would not have resorted to cannibalism if placed in the same dire circumstances. So in the case of Alfred Packer, the most pertinent question was, did his companions die as a result of his incompetence, or was greed the motivating factor? By early spring of 1883, Packer had been on the run for almost 9 years. Despite being one of the most infamous individuals in the entire United States, there wasn't a single reported sighting of him for almost a decade. That all changed when a man named Frenchy Cabazon arrived in the Wyoming state capital of Cheyenne. Frenchy was a traveling salesman who roamed from town to town plying his trade from the back of a wagon, but Frenchy also happened to have been one of the original members of Robert McGrew's prospecting party who'd wintered at Chief Ouray's camp during the winter of 1874. Frenchy's wagon pulled into Cheyenne in early March of 1883, and on Sunday the 11th, he and several other traders set up along the thoroughfare to do business with local townsfolk. Frenchy served dozens of customers that morning, many of whom were headed home from church. But when one man stepped up to his wagon and sought to peruse his goods, Frenchy found his face to be curiously familiar. "Don't I know you?" Frenchy asked. The stranger returned his gaze, revealing piercing blue eyes that Frenchy was certain he'd seen before. "No, sir," he replied. "What's your name?" Frenchy asked, studying the man's rough, dark goatee and how his shoulder-length hair was slick with pomade. "John Schwartza," the man replied, clearly irritated by Frenchy's incessant inquiries. Frenchy apologized, claiming he'd confused the stranger with an old acquaintance. Yet in truth, there had been no such confusion. Frenchy Cabazon was quite certain of the stranger's identity, and following the conclusion of their business, Frenchy rushed to the local sheriff's office and begged them to send a message to General Charles Adams of the Los Pinos Indian Agency. A dangerous fugitive was present in Cheyenne, one that had been wanted for murder for the past 9 years, and his name was Alfred Packer. General Adams and a handful of agency officers rode day and night until they reached Cheyenne. Then, following the confirmation of his identity, Packer was taken to Denver by train on March 16th of 1883. Packer explained that he'd only escaped from Saguache due to his fear of imminent vigilante justice, and expressed a desire to give a second, much more truthful account of how he survived his ordeal in the San Juan Mountains. Instead of claiming that the men were gradually eaten as they died off one by one, Packer now claimed that Bell had killed the others after ordering him to collect firewood. Packer departed in the morning, then returned in the late evening. According to the second of his signed confessions, this is what he found. "I found Bell, who acted crazy in the morning, sitting near the fire roasting a piece of meat which he had cut from the leg of Miller. His skull was crushed in with the hatchet. The other 3 were lying near the fire. They were cut in the forehead with the hatchet. Some had 2 or 3 cuts. I got closer to the fire, and when Bell saw me, he got up with his hatchet and charged towards me. When I shot him sideways through the belly, he fell on his face. I grabbed the hatchet and hit him on the top of the head. Packer claimed he then dropped the revolver in a patch of deep snow and lost sight of it. After that, he constructed a crude shelter out of stray logs and then hunkered down to wait out a heavy storm. He claimed days went by, his hunger growing ever more intense until finally he could bear it no longer. He tried to get away every day but could not, Packer said, so I lived off the flesh of these men for almost 60 days. General Adams then asked Packer why he hadn't told the truth during his first confession. "I was excited," Packer reportedly replied. "I wanted to say something, and the story as I told it came first in my mind." Finally, on April 6th of 1883, Packer pled not guilty at the opening of his trial in Lake City, Colorado. The prosecution claimed that the only logical explanation for Packer's actions was that the killings were premeditated, while the defense argued against him being a murderer and claimed cannibalism was essential to his survival. After 7 days of testimonies and examinations, he was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to death by hanging. Yet Packer was eventually spared the death penalty due to a legal technicality. He might have cheated death a second time, but he was still legally culpable for the deaths of his traveling companions. A second trial was held in Gunnison, Colorado in June of 1886. Only this time, Packer was found guilty on 5 counts of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 40 years in prison. At the time, Packer's 40 years in prison constituted the longest custodial sentence ever handed down in the United States, and it stunned the American public. He was encouraged to lodge multiple appeals and sent letters to national newspapers claiming that he had been, and I quote, unjustly convicted by an unfair and unsympathetic judicial system, and by the ignorant conclusions and judgments of small-minded people. Eventually, on February 8th of 1901, Packer was paroled after serving 18 years of his 40-year sentence, and upon his release, he expressed a huge amount of gratitude towards a woman named Polly Pry. Polly Pry was the pen name of Leonelle O'Brien, an ambitious young reporter with the Denver Post. Upon learning of Packer's military service, she used her platform to paint him as a courageous former soldier whose only crime was getting caught up with what she referred to as a regrettable situation. She called him a victim of circumstance who did what he had to do to survive, but one who had been, quote, crucified for violating civilized sensibilities by having to resort to cannibalism. The column inches she dedicated to Packer prompted the launch of a petition, one which made it onto the desk of the Colorado governor, Charles Thomas. Thomas was initially reluctant to involve himself in this situation, but after months upon months of pressure, one of his final acts as governor was to have Alfred Packer paroled, under the condition he would not attempt to profit from his story. 6 years following his release, on April 23rd of 1907, Alfred Packer passed away in Jefferson County, Colorado, aged 65 years old. Some have cited his cause of death as being dementia, others blame a stroke, and while rumors abounded that he became a vegetarian before he died, many reported Packer as living modestly and charitably during his final few years. Buried in Littleton, Colorado, Packer's grave is marked with a veteran's tombstone, listing his original regiment from 1862. But while he might well lie in a soldier's grave, his reputation will always be that of a charlatan, a murderer, and a cannibal. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m., and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/Let'sReadOfficial or send it over email, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.